Today, I'm going to show you how to shoot in manual mode. Today, I will show you how to shoot in manual mode, and it will take your photography to a whole new standard. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. My name is Brendan Diver, and if this is your first time here, I'll be giving tips and advice on all things photography. If there's a video that you would like to see, please leave a message below in the comments and I'll try and get that video created for you. If you give this video a like, subscribe to my channel and click on the bell notification icon so you won't miss any videos in the future. It's all about the light. Your camera needs light in order to make photographs, and it needs just the right amount of light to make a nice exposed image. Your camera has three ways of letting light in: the aperture, the camera shutter, which is shutter speed, and the sensitivity of the sensor, which is known as ISO. These are often referred to as the exposure triangle. Balancing these three camera settings to let in just the right amount of light is what shooting in manual mode is all about. Your camera's built-in light meter is how you work to balance these different settings. The light meter will look something like this. How to read your camera light meter. So if you make note of the minus sign on the left hand side and the plus sign on the right, when your light meter has the lines or dots shown towards the plus symbol, it's a sign that your photo is moving towards being overexposed or too bright. When your light meter has lines or dots moving towards the minus symbol, your photo is moving towards being underexposed, or in other words, too dark. Using your camera's built-in light meter to balance aperture, shutter and ISO. You can and you should use your camera's built-in light meter to tell you if you have too much light or too little light coming through the lens. The goal is to have it somewhere near the middle. Balancing aperture, shutter speed and ISO and learning how to do this takes time, but keep practicing, it will come to you. If you let in more light one way, you may need to reduce the amount of light you let in through one of the other ways. If you let in less light one way, you may need to increase the amount of light you let in through one of the other means. One important note, manual mode is not the same as manual focus. Manual mode is when you control the depth of field, exposure, and freezing action or creating motion blur. Manual focus is when you move away from automatic focus and you're taking control of getting the focus yourself. We're not talking about manual focus, that is something completely different. Continue letting your camera use autofocus, which is what I do about 95% of the time, and it works really well. Now that we've covered the important reasons why you should be learning to shoot in manual mode and how to use your light meter, let's take a close look at the three important elements that make up the exposure triangle. Aperture. This is an important setting to understand and use properly if you want to take great photos. But what is aperture? Aperture is like the pupil of your eye. It can be opened or closed down depending on how much light you want to enter the camera. When you're in low light conditions, you will probably want your aperture opened up as much as possible. On the opposite end, when you encounter bright conditions, you might want the option to close the aperture down to let in less light to compensate. Aperture also controls the depth of field that is in focus or out of focus. If you want a very shallow depth of field with that background blurred out, aperture is what you use. So what is an f-stop and how does it relate to aperture? An f-stop is the number on your camera that tells how open or closed the aperture is. Now the most confusing thing about aperture and the f-stop number is the smaller f-stop number, the larger the aperture opening is and the more light you are able to let in. The larger the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture opening is and the less light you're able to let in your camera. Aperture, f-stops and depth of field. Aperture not only lets in light, but it's also one powerful way to control your depth of field. Depth of field is the amount of your image that is in perfect focus between your camera and the furthest your eye can see. Basically, how blurry you want the background to be or how much will be in focus. In the real world, when our eyes survey a scene, everything we see is in focus unless your eyesight's really bad, but that's not always the case in camera. The smaller the f-stop aperture, the less depth of field that you have. That means if I set my aperture to f2.8 and focus on my subject, there's not going to be much behind or in front that's going to be in focus. But if I set my aperture to f16 and focus on my subject, much more behind and in front will be in focus. So you're going to get a greater depth of field that you're going to be able to see. You can clearly see this demonstrated in this example. Notice the change in the depth of field achieved at the 6 different f-stop aperture settings. How to adjust aperture on a Canon camera. Make sure you're in manual mode prior to following these instructions below. To set the aperture on your Canon AR series cameras, depress the shutter release button until the meter is activated. Then using your thumb, turn the large dial on the back of the camera. How to adjust aperture on a Nikon camera. To set the aperture on Nikon's entry-level cameras, depress the shutter release button until the meter is activated. Then, using your index finger, hold down the button and the little aperture circle next to it on the top of the camera, and then use your thumb to turn the main dial. To set the aperture on Nikon's semi-pro or pro-line cameras, depress the shutter release button until the meter is activated. Then, using your index finger, turn the sub-command dial on the front of the camera beneath the shutter release button. You may find that you do not have access to all the f-stops mentioned above. This is because your camera lens controls the lowest aperture that you can access. Your camera only controls the highest aperture you have available. So it's your lens that actually determines what aperture you can go down to the smallest number. Understanding shutter speed for beginners. Now that we've talked about aperture, I'm going to talk today and focus on the second of the three important elements that make up the all-important exposure triangle, and that is shutter speed. This is a crucial setting to understand and use properly if you want to take great photos. So what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is another way to let light into the camera, and in my opinion is a little more straightforward than aperture. The shutter is what clicks when you press the button to take a picture. Think of it like a little curtain in your camera body that opens to let light in and then closes it to stop the camera from recording more light. The speed the shutter opens and closes is what determines how much light is what the camera records. Shutter speed is measured in seconds and is typically shown as fractions: 1/25th, 1/250th, 1/500th. For example, a shutter speed of 1/500th will open the shutter 1/500th of a second. As you can see in the following example, I photographed the same subject 6 different times while only adjusting my shutter speed setting for each photo. Notice the slower shutter speeds. Here, starting at 1/125th will allow more light in to enter the camera than the faster shutter speeds. The fastest shutter speed demonstrated in the example is 1/4000th of a second, which is very little light to enter and will result in a very dark exposure. In general, because faster shutter speeds let in less light into your camera, they are used more often for daytime photography. As you can guess, the slower the shutter speed, that will let more light in, and it will work best if you do night photography in low light. Here's a useful tip. It's helpful to know that your camera typically shortens these numbers in the viewfinder. For example, your camera would show 1/100th of a second by just displaying 100 in the viewfinder. Shutter speed is also used to control the amount of motion in a photograph. A slow shutter speed is often selected to capture movement in an image, because a slow shutter speed and a moving object will produce some blur in your image. Faster shutter speeds are used to freeze motion and action without blur. This diagram here is a great reference to help you remember which shutter speeds allow for more or less light into the camera, which can cause blur or are good for freezing action, and which shutter speeds need a tripod or can be shot while hand-holding your camera. Where to start with shutter speed? You can determine the best shutter speed to use based on your subject you're shooting, as well as the available light. When photographing children, I try not to go below 1/125th of a second or 1/250th. To capture a person in mid-air, you might use a very faster shutter speed, say 1/1000th of a second. Holding your camera in your hands while shooting at lower shutter speeds will cause blur, so when I'm photographing this way, I'll always try and not let my shutter speed go below my focal length number. For example, if I'm using a 50mm lens, I'll try and keep my shutter at least 1/60th of a second. If I'm using a zoom lens at 200mm, I'll try and keep my shutter speed at 1/250th of a second. How to change your shutter speed on a Nikon camera? First of all, make sure that you're in manual mode prior to following the instructions. To set your shutter speed on a Nikon camera, depress the shutter release button until the meter is activated. Then, using your thumb, rotate the main command dial. How to adjust shutter speed on your Canon camera? Again, make sure that you're in manual mode prior to follow these instructions. To set your shutter speed on a Canon camera, depress the shutter release button until the meter is activated. Then, with your index finger, turn the main dial on the top of your camera. Understanding ISO. Now, I talked already about shutter speed and how it works. Now I'm going to focus on the last of the 3 important elements of the exposure triangle, and that's ISO. This is a very important setting to use properly if you want to take the best possible photos. So what is ISO? ISO measures the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. The term ISO has been carried over from the days of film. Film is made up of little tiny crystals or grains. At ISO 100 to 200, those crystal grains are very tiny and need more light to expose them. So with ISO 1600 or 3200 film, the crystal grains are larger and thus need less light to expose them. The trade-off though is that the larger crystal grains are more noticeable and your photographs are less smooth and more grainy. Digital cameras have ISO equivalents. However, with digital cameras, it isn't crystal grains that have become noticeable as the ISO numbers get larger, it's the pixels that become more noticeable as noise or as grain. At lower ISOs, your camera sensor will need more light to create a nicely exposed photo, and you might see much less grain or noise in the photo. So what ISO should I use? As a general rule, you want to keep your ISO as low as possible. However, this doesn't mean that you should always shoot with an ISO of 100. When photographing indoors, there's much less available light than when you're photographing outside in the sun. In these low light situations, you should use whatever light you have available and then raise your ISO as necessary to get a good exposure. So why is this? Well, because capturing a nicely exposed photo is more important than worrying about grain or noise. Use lower ISO numbers when you have lots of light available, for example outdoors where there's nice light in the sunshine. Use high ISO numbers when you have little light available, indoors in the evening or outdoors when the sun is setting, or say for example night photography. Digital cameras have really improved their ISO capabilities in the last several years, and many current cameras have the ability to shoot at really high ISOs with relatively little grain or noise, so don't worry about boosting up the ISO. So, how do I change the ISO settings on your Canon camera? To adjust the ISO on your Canon camera, press the ISO button and rotate the main command dial. ISO button is found on the top of the camera in one of the locations on this diagram I show. How to change the ISO settings on your Nikon camera? To adjust the ISO on your Nikon entry-level camera, press the info button and then using the back circular dial, select ISO and then set the number you want to press. Some entry-level Nikon cameras have touchscreens that allow you to adjust ISO using the touchscreen. Since setting ISO requires a few steps, consider setting the FN button on the front of your camera to adjust your ISO. Consult your manual for the exact steps on how to do this. To adjust the ISO on your Nikon Pro or Semi-Pro camera, press the ISO button, rotate the main command dial. The ISO button will either be located on the top or the back of your camera, depending on the model. So make sure you remember these general rules about ISO before moving on to the next part of our tutorial. Lower ISO numbers are less sensitive to light and produce little noise or grain, so use a lower ISO when you have lots of light. Higher ISO numbers are more sensitive to light but produce more grain or noise, so use a higher ISO when you have less light available. Now, let's move on to about the histogram. One of the tools most frequently overlooked for the beginner and improving photographer is the histogram. The histogram is full of information that you can use to make your photographs more interesting to the viewer. So what is a histogram? In photography, a histogram is a graph showing the distribution of the light in an image. Most cameras are capable of displaying a histogram for each image stored on the camera's memory card. Some cameras even allow you to see a live histogram before you take the shot. The features may vary from camera to camera, so consult your camera manual to find out how to display the histogram on your camera. Your image is made up of millions of pixels, and every pixel has a value representing its colour. The pixel's brightness is derived from this value. A histogram will show you the number of pixels of each brightness in your image. The scale along the bottom of the histogram goes from left to right, from 0% brightness, which is black, to 100% brightness, which is white. The taller the peak, the more pixels of that brightness that there are in the image. So, I hope you enjoyed this video this week, and I hope you got benefit from it there. If there's any videos that you would like me to create in the future, let me know in the comments below and I'll get that video created for you. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon.